It was 113 degrees when I arrived in my new apartment in Phoenix, Arizona. The cabin of the U-Haul truck was air-conditioned, so I hadn't felt the heat until I opened the door. And then it hit me, like a hot blow dryer to the face. And all I could think of in that moment was, oh no, what have I done? Are humans even supposed to exist in heat like this? A month earlier, I was living in Los Angeles, fighting the traffic and grinding my butt off for a microchip company I work for. I'm a programmer and work in a team that writes embedded software in microchips. Though I was at the bottom of the totem pole at that time. My boss approached me one day and offered me a new position. He called it a promotion. The only problem was, the new position was 400 miles away in Arizona. But the offer was way too good for me to refuse. So I took it. So now there I was, profusely sweating, skin burning under the scorching Arizona sun, as I moved my stuff into my new apartment. I was exactly 1 year into my new position when it all happened. The first case of coronavirus in the US. The news was talking about quarantine and lockdown, but I never thought they would actually make everyone quarantine. Boy, was I wrong. A short time after that, I found myself confined to my small apartment, the outside world growing distant by the day. The days began to blur into each other. It was summer again, and the temperatures grew increasingly hotter by the day. Nighttime gave little relief from the oppressive, suffocating heat. With the air conditioning humming like a distant ghost, I fell into the routine of work in isolation. At first, it was just a faint sound, a soft crying that drifted through the thin walls. I tried to ignore it, but the sound persisted, becoming a haunting presence that echoed in my mind. Days turned into weeks, and still, the crying continued. And after a while, I started to become concerned. What if this person needs help, or just someone to talk to? I walked over and knocked on the apartment door, but there was no response. I asked if she was okay, or needed help, but again, no response. I pressed my ear against the door to try and hear what was happening inside the apartment, and to my surprise, a voice answered. I'm here. I'm so lonely. But nothing else. I asked if she needed help and tried to engage in conversation, but all I got in response was sobbing. She obviously didn't want to talk to anyone, so I eventually went back to my apartment. The crying didn't stop though. It continued for days. One day, I decided to call out through the thin walls. To my surprise, she responded. Her name was Vivian, and through her own whispered conversations, she revealed fragments of her life. Vivian was originally from Idaho, but she had moved to LA looking to get into acting. Things had not gone as planned, and she ended up in Phoenix with her abusive alcoholic boyfriend. They broke up, and she had not seen him for a long time. She didn't know anyone in Phoenix, and she was lonely. I felt an inexplicable connection to her and a need to help, but it didn't matter what I said. The crying continued. A few days later, I noticed that the crying had completely stopped. I knocked on the wall and called her name, but there was no answer. Days went by, and I figured she had gone out of town or back home to Idaho. A few days after that, I was checking my mailbox in the lobby and spotted my apartment manager. It had been a long time since I spoke to another person, in person, so I decided to start a conversation. And we mostly made small talk. We talked about the city, the hiking trails, and how beautiful Arizona is in the fall, winter, and spring. We also talked about the craziness of lockdown and how he had not spoke to another person in months. I told him that other than my neighbor through the wall, me too. I also mentioned that I had not heard from her for a while and asked if he had seen her. The manager's expression shifted quickly. He told me the apartment has been empty for 3 years. He caught a group of 6 squatters in that apartment once, and he bet that's who I was talking with, a squatter. He said he would check the apartment, and I told him I would go with him. The manager fumbled through a set of what seemed like 50 keys, hung on a hoop ring, clipped to his jeans belt loop. He tried a few keys unsuccessfully before finding the right one. As we stepped into the apartment, the air felt thick and stale, heavy with unease, almost like when you sense someone staring at you from behind. The apartment was barren, untouched, and the windows were sealed tight. It looked like no one had been in there for years. The manager looked over at me with an unmistakable look. The look that said, "There, are you happy now? Thanks for wasting my time." Feeling like I had to prove something, but mostly that I'm not crazy, I began to tell the manager everything the girl had told me. I told him that she was 24 years old, did some acting in small roles, possibly lived with her boyfriend, and her name was Vivian. He had a look of fear in his face that grew even more intense with every detail I gave him about her. "If you're talking about who I think you're talking about, that girl's dead," he said in a shaky voice. He then told me about the tragedy in apartment 305. A woman was killed by her boyfriend, he said. She was dismembered and her body stuffed in the fridge. The rent was paid for a full year, so no one discovered the body until the eviction cleanup crew came in. My stomach dropped as the weight of the manager's words sunk in. I felt sick, and the room began to spin. I had been talking to a ghost. We exited the apartment pretty quickly after that, and I didn't look back. That night, I booked a hotel and stayed there for the rest of the week until I could find a new apartment. Once I did, I hired a moving crew to move me out, and never again returned to that apartment. So if you ever hear someone calling to you in the dark of night, just remember, some stories don't end, they linger, waiting for someone to listen. And sometimes, what you hear may come from a place best left undisturbed.
I'm here. I'm so lonely.